Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I am Chris Weave, and this is Starfleet Tactical, as always. I am by myself tonight. Well, I've got Lissa. Lissa, come on for a second. Hey, Lissa.
Hey.
So I've got Lissa here tonight with me. I'm going to do a presentation in just a moment, but I was just thinking about whether there was anything special going on that we needed to talk about.
Just next weekend, I won't be here because I'm spending time with my partner and his kids.
Yes. Okay. So that's a good point. I did ask Alec if he wanted to be on tonight. He never responded to me, so I think he just was off off Facebook.
It sounds like Alec.
We may get him on. I had grand plans for what I was going to do tonight, and I ended up not doing those plans at all. I'm doing another presentation instead of the one that I planned on doing, because I realized that it was just going to be. I was doing one that I thought was going to be relatively easy, which is this one, the Prefect Operational Briefing. So I told everybody about it last time. I said I was going to do it at some point. It's a very, very interesting briefing, and it's an interesting science fiction setup, and I was going to talk about it. And I realized that there's a lot more thinking I have to do because it's really the introduction to. Basically, there was the part that's in the book, and then there's the other part that I have to add on to it. And it may actually end up being a two-parter as a result of that. And I decided that it was making my head hurt, so I stopped working on it. So, it is. And let's see, this past week I did a conference, a one-day wargaming conference called Connections Online Showcase. That it's not up on YouTube yet, unlisted, but it will be. So if people want to see what I do when I'm not doing starships, it's me being on YouTube a bunch without ever mentioning starships even once. But Lissa helped out the last time we did a 3-day conference back in April, and yep. Lissa made it happen. And this was just a one-day conference. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. When I called you back out here, there was something else I was going to. I can't remember. There was something else I was going to say, and I can't remember what it is. Other than Lissa's not here next week, I will be. I won't be here the week after because I'll be at a science fiction convention, and then I'll be here for 2 weeks, and then I'll be. Then we get to Thanksgiving weekend, and I won't be here Thanksgiving weekend because I'll be at a science fiction convention. And I'm not exactly sure when Pat comes back. Pat, last I checked, Pat was still in Norway. So.
Oh, I'm jealous.
Yeah, well, he's working, but I mean,
I'm still jealous.
Yeah, he's getting to be in Norway, and so that was fun. And some of you may have seen that he and I were part of a group of people that did the STO Fleet Week. We did an STO Fleet Week session that I think we mentioned on this show. And yeah, in fact, I did a little one-off because I forgot to actually mention it on the show. So I did a quick little 5-minute little video saying that we were going to do it. But that was a lot of fun too. So I was in my brother's basement for that one. So, but I want to say there was something else I was going to say, and I'm totally, my brain is not working.
Look, my brain has gone burr the entire week, so I don't know what to tell you, Chris. I mean, I talked to you about what's going on earlier.
Yeah. So I'm, so for what it's worth, I'm actually doing relatively well. I know a lot of other people who have family issues, etc. My family's doing pretty good, and health-wise, I'm doing pretty good. I got.
There you go, Delon.
Yes. Thank you, Delon. I'm going to cover that in the presentation. But I did I got some of that sweet iron sucrose on Monday, and the previous Monday before that. And I'm going to get some more on this coming Monday. And so it seems to help. And then we'll wait a couple of months, and they'll take measure all the stuff in my blood and see if I've got how I'm doing. Because because basically all the indicators indicate I've got an iron problem. I'm not getting iron into my blood. This is a Mark 1 Mod 0, totally, completely explainable side effect of having a gastric bypass surgery 5 years ago. 5 years ago? Yeah, about that, 2018. So I guess four and a half. And totally and completely explainable side effect of that. Totally and completely explainable. And in fact, so much so that whenever I would be talking with one of the hematologists about it, and they'd be in full hardcore diagnostic mode, and then I'd say, yeah, and I had a gastric bypass, I had an RNY, and they'd immediately shift from diagnostic mode into treatment mode, because it's like, problem solved. We know what's going on here. It's just now all about treatment, and they'd immediately shifted, saying, okay, you're probably going to need X, you're probably going to need Y. We'll do some stuff, etc. So,
yep.
So that's pretty good. So I'm actually feeling much better than I was before. Before I was able to sort of get the fundamentals done, but I would, I'd be able to put together the presentation for the show and then give the presentation, and then I would be like down for the count the next day. Now I'm actually doing pretty good. So, but oh well.
That's good. You're not using too many spoons because your health has declined.
Yeah, they've been giving me spoons back. My dad at one point said, after I got the first infusion, he said, so do you feel better? And I said, no, that's not how this works. Getting the iron infusion is the equivalent of buying the yarn. So I bought the yarn and handed it to my red blood, or to my bone marrow, so that my bone marrow could crochet me some new red blood cells. So I've bought the yarn and I've given it to the people that need the yarn, and got to wait for a while for the crocheting to take effect. But it seems to be working. So,
but for anyone who is unaware of what we're referring to when we say spoons, look up spoon theory. Yes. It tends to deal with mental health and chronic illness. Yeah. The idea behind it is that each day you essentially are given a certain amount of spoons. And each activity that you do throughout the day costs a certain amount of spoons. And that cost can be a sliding scale depending on the day, too. Yeah. So, like, one day, taking a shower might take 1 spoon. But the next day, it might take 2 or 3.
The number of spoons you get each day varies too.
Yes, the number of spoons you get each day varies, and it's the spoons represent how much energy you have to direct towards tasks.
I've always wondered why spoons. Spoons strike me as being a very odd form of currency.
There've been a couple different ways that people have described it: spoons, forks. I've seen sporks.
What's with the cutlery?
Because it's easy for people to remember.
Okay.
Probably. But like, for example, ADHD, some people use forks as an example because a fork has different tines, and each task that you do because of an ADHD brain, all right, well, this task actually is going to be broken up into these 4 tasks because, I started this, but I saw this, and so I need to start on that, and,
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah,
Delon, you would be surprised. Not everyone understands, at least spoon theory. Everyone knows what a spoon is. They don't understand how spoons deal with energy.
Well, it's something that I think, 4 years ago, a lot of people wouldn't have gotten, but today more people get it than.
Well, especially after the pandemic, when more people were seeking treatment for chronic illnesses and mental health and things like that. Like, we say we have a mental health crisis, and that's still true. But I don't think it's necessarily that more people were having issues with mental health during the pandemic. It's just that it shed a light on the fact that people were now seeking treatment for it.
I think there was a little bit of both, because I think there was
There's definitely some people that were affected by it, but I think overall, it's not necessarily that there were significantly more people that had a mental health issue. It's that the people that had the mental health issues, it finally got to the point where, oh, hey, I probably should go see someone about this because access was starting to become better because of things like better health. And don't get me wrong, a lot of these online mental health services have a lot of things wrong with them. There's a lot wrong with how their business models have been. But people now all of a sudden had access to mental health treatment that they didn't necessarily have prior to it, because you might be in the middle of nowhere, fucking South Dakota, and there's no psychologist within 100-mile radius of you, you know?
I think there were people that I know some extroverts who were having severe issues with being locked in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I'm ambivert. The way I dealt with it was I went online and made friends.
I started a YouTube show.
I started several shows.
I got drafted into a YouTube show. I love telling the story about how, I get invited on with Alec one night because, Alec sends me this message saying, hey, what are you up to tonight? I looked at it and I went, Alec wants me to be on his show. I got nothing going on, Alec. What are you up to? Hey, how'd you like to be on the show? And next thing I know, I'm invited back. Next thing I know, Pat's on a show. He was on the Wednesday show. And next thing I know, Pat and I are hosting a show. And at no point did Alex say, you guys want to host a show? It just sort of happened. He changed the name of the show.
It kind of happened.
That's great. It's fantastic. It's the best thing. For me personally, it's the best thing that's come out of the pandemic.
Oh, yeah. No, like me streaming and everything like that has definitely been one of the best things that came out of the pandemic, because like, had the pandemic not happened, I probably wouldn't have fallen down the TikTok rabbit hole, and I wouldn't have half as many of my friends that I've been, using as a support system the past couple years.
Yeah, me too. So it's been a lot of fun. I should probably do my presentation. So I'll see you later. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Naval Command and Control today. And we're going to talk, it'll be like a normal sort of Chris presentation. At the very end, I'll tie it back into science fiction, etc. But this is one of those things that whenever I went to sea, many of you heard me say, whenever I went to sea, I had two notebooks with me. One that I used to collect all the data that I was going to use for the for whatever exercise I was doing. And the other one was specifically to write down stuff that I thought was interesting from a science fiction standpoint, and so that I could later tell that to people. And so this is one of the things that I encountered, was how the Navy does command and control. And I think it's actually very, very interesting and very relevant for a lot of the science fiction that we see out there. Not just Star Trek, but other things as well. So I'm going to talk about that. But first, I'm going to turn off the banner because I think everybody's got the idea, and I'm going to say it again here. So a lot of this stuff is stuff that you've heard, this stuff up front. You've all heard it before, but I'm going to say it again because, sometimes I don't know whether the person watching this is one of the longtime viewers who's heard me say this 100 times, or whether it's somebody who's hearing me say it for the first time. So I'll go ahead and say it. So this talk isn't about anybody else other than me. It's my opinion. It's not anybody else's opinion. It's not a comprehensive discussion, and it's not an argument in favor of the right way to do things. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, suggesting that science fiction doesn't work if you don't do it this way. I'm saying there's this interesting thing in the real world that I think has some relevance. If nothing else, it has relevance as a way of comparing. Maybe you don't need it in your science fiction universe. So the answer to the question of, well, why don't you need it? Why wouldn't this be useful is interesting. But as always, nothing I say should prevent anyone from enjoying any work of science fiction. It just shouldn't. So Please don't blame me. Oh, you know what? I forgot that for this, I have to actually use the mouse. So here's an outline of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about real-world naval command and control. I'm going to talk about some implications for science fiction. And I'm going to maybe do an appendix, which I've actually, it's the Arleigh Burke DDG CIC, which I did a long time ago, like a year and a half. But it might be worth revisiting because there's some people who probably didn't see it when I did it a year and a half ago. So, yeah, I made some last minute changes to bring some stuff back in, and I actually screwed up the talk because I've already talked about what this talk isn't a little bit. I need to go through and fix this, so I'll go through and fix this. So here's the bottom line up front. The U.S. Navy has developed a command and control doctrine designed to deal with the particular set of circumstances that the Navy runs into. And that these circumstances really sort of came about in the post-war era, and they remain applicable today, although it's not necessarily, in some ways it's less pressing because we don't have a large Soviet threat to worry about. But in some ways it's just as applicable because electronic warfare has gotten even better, and also because we're dealing with hypersonic missiles and other things that are happening on faster timelines. So in some ways the threat has gotten better, in other ways the threat has gotten stronger. In some ways weaker, some ways stronger. And those of you who have seen me talk and know that a lot of times I will be, let's call it critical of the idea of just sort of taking real world history and filing off the serial numbers and adding in space on the end and calling it science fiction. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think that you can learn from the real world stuff. I very dramatically do think that you can learn from the real world. I just don't think that you should, that it's automatically the case that the way that you get science fiction navies is to take real world navies and just add in space on the end. I think studying the real world, studying real history can help inform your decision-making process. So if you are a writer or you are a consumer of science fiction, you can learn from that. But I don't think that the right answer, is that you just sort of, you copy and paste it in there. In this particular case, though, I think you could copy and paste this doctrine under certain circumstances, and I'll talk about that. There are certain places where I've looked at this and I said, I think this would work. And like I said, I'll talk about that at the end. But like all comparisons between the real world navies and science fiction navies, the comparison isn't perfect. And it's highly dependent on the specific assumptions you get into. And so from that standpoint, I'm not suggesting, I'm painting with a broad brush here. I'm saying, let me tell you about the type of situation that generated these ideas. And if you find yourself in a similar situation, it might make sense. Okay, so here's a few questions that by the end of this talk, you should be able to answer. One is, who does the commander of the air group on an aircraft carrier work for? Who decides the steaming formation of a carrier battle group or a carrier strike group? Who decides when to attack a submarine? You'd think that it would be the admiral in charge, right? There's an admiral on board the aircraft carrier. Does he make those decisions? Well, I'll give you a little insight. No, he doesn't. He's ultimately responsible. The people who work for him make those decisions, and I'll tell you about how they go about making those decisions and who makes what decision when. So, first of all, be aware. My information dates back to November of 2004. That is the last time that I went to sea. I've done a little spot checking. There's been a few little changes here and there with some of the particulars, like they've renamed a couple of positions, etc. I'm not going to try to give you the most current names. I'm going to use the November 2004 stuff that I knew because I can answer the questions about November 2004 stuff. we're talking about history and how it applies to science fiction. We're not talking about how to do this in the real world right now. So from that standpoint, just be aware of the fact that take everything I'm saying with a little grain of salt in terms of what your understanding of the current world is going to be. So I'm going to go through some important concepts. I'm going to go through the history of how we got behind that stuff. And then I'm going to talk about the composite warfare commander system. Oh, by the way, that particular Arleigh Burke class destroyer that I picked, that is the USS Higgins. I picked that in particular because when I revamped this presentation and I picked that slide, one of my former coworkers was the commanding officer of the Higgins at that point. He is since Commander Mark Delteet. He's since been promoted. He's now a Navy captain, and he works in San Diego. And I don't know that he ever watches the show. I don't think he does. But when I went looking for a picture of an Arleigh Burke, which the Arleigh Burkes are my favorite warships. I think they're just beautiful ships. And when I went looking for a picture of an Arleigh Burke, I specifically sought out a picture of the Higgins. Okay, a few important concepts. First of all, when I talk about command and control, what do I mean by command? So command has the following attributes. You have the authority to make the decisions. You have the responsibility that goes along with that authority. And you have the accountability. You will be held accountable for your decisions. You are responsible for making the decisions, and you have the authority to make the decisions. Plus, you are in a leadership role, so you're leading your people. Leadership is all about people. So command is about those four things. Control is about how you exercise your authority. It gives you the ability to monitor. So it's not just about telling people to do something. You have to be able to verify what's going on. You have to be able to monitor the outside world. You have to be able to monitor what your people are doing or it doesn't count, and influence those things by taking actions, including by giving them orders. And you need to have feedback to know whether it's working or not. If you don't have those things, you don't really have control. Control can be exercised in a couple of different ways. It can be detailed or it can be mission. So mission is when the person who is in command says, this is what I want you to do. Go figure out how to do it and go do it. Right? So go to the store, buy the groceries that we need, bring them back. Go get groceries. Detailed is much more specific. Here's an exact list of what I need you to get at the store. Go to this particular store, go at this time, do the things. So detailed is telling you exactly what to do. Mission is just telling you basically what end state you want to achieve. In fact, you might not even say go to the store and get groceries. It might just be like, I need to have the stuff I'm going to cook tonight. I need to have the stuff to cook. Make it happen. So as a general rule, the U.S. tries to give mission type orders, and we rely upon our subordinates to figure out how to get things done and do it. And because it's a lot easier on the chain of command in order to do it that way, and you generally get better results. A few other important concepts. So I'm going to talk about strike groups. I earlier mentioned battle groups, but I'm going to primarily talk about strike groups. A strike group can be either a carrier strike group or an expeditionary strike group. I don't know that we still use expeditionary strike groups, though they were in vogue around 2005, 2004, maybe a little bit earlier. The idea was that you'd take an amphibious ready group, which is a bunch of amphibs with a bunch of Marines on board, and you'd add some surface fleet assets to give them a striking capability, and that generally means the ability to fire tomahawks. It also gives some inherent defensive capabilities. I think the expeditionary strike groups generally got broken up once they got in theater, and the surface ships would get sent off to do individual tasking. The escorts would get sent off to do individual tasking, and then the amphibs would go do whatever the amphibs were going to do. A carrier strike group is like a carrier battle group, but it's much smaller. It only has a couple of escorts along with it. So you might have like a cruiser and 2 destroyers. along with the carrier, or you might have 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers. Back in the old days, the farther back you go, the bigger these things were. Back in the old days, it wasn't unusual to have a carrier battle group that had a carrier and 11 escorts, and then plus an oiler or something like that, a storage ship of some sort. Nowadays, a strike group sort of is split up smaller. Now, nobody thinks that a strike group has the same offensive punch that a carrier battle group does, but the idea is that you can mix and match, and so you can right size the threat a little bit better. At some point in the future, I'm going to do a talk on line of battle versus battle groups versus battle lines, basically. And this will be an important concept when I do that, about why would you organize as a battle group? Why would you organize as a strike group versus a line of battle? And it really sort of has to do a lot of it with how you do command and control and how you sort of move your chess pieces around on the board. I'll also talk about either a combat information center or a combat direction center. So combat information center exists on escorts and small boys. Combat direction, or escorts, destroyers, cruisers, other ships like that. Combat direction center is what you see on an aircraft carrier. They're essentially the same thing. Now, in British usage, and hence Commonwealth Navy usage, you might hear a reference to an ops center. Ops center is basically the same thing. In US usage, if we talk about something like as an ops center, it means it's something ashore. We don't talk about ops centers at sea. But that's how the Brits refer to it. And then there's something on carriers called a Tactical Flag Command Center. And the TFCC is where the admiral and his staff are. So other people are in the Combat Direction Center fighting the ship, fighting the battle group. The TFCC does oversight, and I'll explain exactly what they do. Other ideas we're thinking about are operational control versus tactical control. Operational control is basically, I'm running the battle group. In certain terms of the big picture, operational control may actually be not associated with the battle group per se. You also have administrative control, which includes things like training and other stuff like that before you ever get there. How you actually draw these lines can be complicated. Tactical control is about fighting the battle. It's very much local. Officer and tactical command is usually the admiral commanding the battle group, although if it's split up, it might be somebody smaller, or it's the person who's given the orders and who's responsible for something. So it might be the commander of the strike group. If you're talking about a theater level effort, there might be an officer in tactical command of the theater. For instance, and this is an example that we could debate all day. If you go back to the Battle of Leyte Gulf in World War II, there's a big issue associated with Halsey was there, and Halsey went off and did his own thing at one point, and people criticized Halsey for uncovering the landing force, etc. Halsey was not the officer in tactical command for that battle. Kincaid was the officer in tactical command. He was the one who was responsible for covering the beaches. He was the one responsible for force protection for his forces, not Halsey. Halsey was kind of a free safety with orders that said, sort of hang out in the neighborhood and do what you think is appropriate. So this is one that's guaranteed to generate a big argument. I've had several big arguments about that. But, one of the things that I find very telling is when I talk to naval officers about it, they go, yeah, Kincaid was officer in tactical command. What's the big deal? So the composite warfare commander is usually the battle group or strike group head who's sort of running the scene. Usually the composite warfare commander on a strike group, the composite warfare commander and the officer and tactical command are the same. They have different sets of responsibilities. And one of the things that sort of the way the US Navy does stuff is that it's very common for people to be wearing more than one hat. And it's important which hat they're wearing at any given time. And sometimes you'll see, and I'll talk about this when I talk about talking on the radio, sometimes you'll see people switch hats in the meantime, even while they're talking on the radio. It's also important, the idea of supported versus supporting. If you're supported, it means that everybody is trying to help you do your job. You're the one in charge. If you're supporting, you're told, help this other guy do something. So like if you're helping a friend move, the friend is supported. He's the one who's moving. you're supporting, you're helping it, right? So supported and supporting is an important concept, and military orders are very explicit about who's in charge. This such and such is supported. These other people are supporting. Okay, so World War II.
Here's what I found.
Okay, sorry about that. For some strange reason, my watch decided to talk to me. So, in World War II was characterized on the Navy side by detailed control. You had explicit orders being given. You had very large forces. You had platform leaders and limited search and comm. So what do I mean by platform leaders? I spent some time talking about this back in the days of Trent Hone and Lautenschlager and stuff like that, especially Trent Hone and Lanning. You may recall about how you had the destroyers sort of operated as a group, right? So you had a group of destroyers. They were formed into a squadron. They had a destroyer leader. You had a group of cruisers. They were formed into a squadron. You had a cruiser leader. The different platforms had leaders that were responsible for individual squadrons. And your ability to search was somewhat limited. You had radar, you had airplanes, but they were very limited in their capabilities, and the communications were somewhat limited. I mean, you were limited to voice comms. You might have had teletype stuff, but you didn't have the ability to transfer large amounts of data. You didn't have the ability, and your radio was easily jammed, easily intercepted, sometimes difficult to use, and sometimes it could be slow. So Korea and Vietnam also had detailed control, but the threat was a lot more limited at that point. It was really about air sorties against targets ashore. And as a result, it was really more about sustainment of those forces. It wasn't really about surface combat. So even though the world was beginning to change in this time period in terms of the threat that was potentially posed to carriers, etc., in fact, the world had changed. Atomic weapons really changed things a lot. It forced everybody to spread out a lot more, etc. But in terms of like a conventional threat, the world was changing, but we really didn't have to deal with it. There wasn't a real hardcore pressure that forced us to change how we did command and control. We basically used World War II, modified World War II command and control standards, and just sort of moved them forward. That really started changing, though, in the later half of the 60s. First of all, the Soviet Navy went from being just basically a brown water force, a coastal force, to being something that could directly challenge us. And they were building platforms like there was no tomorrow. They had tactical nuclear weapons. They were putting us in a situation where we were going to have to be able to react quickly to them. Then the watershed moment came in 1967, when a destroyer, an Israeli destroyer, was sunk by surface-to-surface missiles from a Komar-class patrol boat. Now, it's interesting, that particular class of destroyer, I forget exactly what it was. It was a Z class, if I remember correctly. And the interesting thing about it is that there were Z-class destroyers on both sides of that war, because the Brits sold a couple of them to the Israelis and a couple of them to the Egyptians. But in the end, in fact, I think that's the Elliott in the lower left-hand corner. In the end, the Elliott was sunk by these Styx missiles, and the problem just kept on getting worse from there. It was a high-density threat. It was a very quick reaction threat. Things were happening very fast, and the command and control just wasn't keeping up. So this is what you've got at basically throughout the 70s. You've got a rapid growth in the potential threat. It's coming at you from a whole bunch of different directions. It's coming at you from the air in the form of airplanes. It's coming at you from the air in the form of missiles. It's coming at you in the form of submarines and torpedoes. You've got a reduced reaction time for that air stuff because it's getting faster and faster. So we went from propeller-driven airplanes to high subsonic missiles, in some cases supersonic missiles. And in order to coordinate everything, we were becoming and do those detailed orders that we were doing. There was an increased reliance on communications. at the same time that the Russians were really investing in the ability to jam those communications. So we're increasingly reliant on our radios. At the same time, our radios are becoming increasingly vulnerable. And there's just a lot of stuff going on. It's really tough for the admiral to keep it all straight and make it all happen. It's a hard problem, and it was getting worse. So what's the solution? Solution is something called the Composite Warfare Commander System. In which the overall commander, the officer in tactical command, who is the composite warfare commander in this case, delegates to subordinate warfare commanders who have control of individual domains. What do I mean by a domain? You've got an air defense guy. You've got a strike guy. You've got a surface guy. You've got a subsurface guy. And by guy, I mean commander, somebody who has the responsibility to deal with those warfare areas. So the key precepts of the Composite Warfare Commander System are centralized planning with decentralized control. And that means that, you figure out what you're going to do, et cetera, but you sort of push the decision-making down as low as you can get it. You have lots of pre-planned responses. No making it up on the fly. You figure out in advance what you're going to do if something happens, and you do that. They practiced command by negation. Command by negation is a system whereby, I'll get into it a little bit more, but command by negation basically means you tell people what you want them to do and you let them do it. And as long as you're happy with what they're doing, you keep your mouth shut and you let them do it. The idea was also to minimize comms, especially comms from the very top. So the idea was you didn't have to give people detailed instructions. You told them what you wanted them to do, and they would figure out the best way to do it, and they go do it. It was defensive in its orientation because the threats were coming to you. But the idea is that you sort of turned the system on, and it could operate in full defense mode, and you didn't have to worry about micromanaging the defense. While at the same time, offensive authority was retained by the officer in tactical command. So you weren't going to go out and schwack somebody without the OTC giving you an explicit order to go do that. But in terms of defending the battle group, because it was battle groups at the time, you would have the authority to defend the battle group and then just let the OTC know that you were doing it. Actually, the OTC is listening. He's going to hear you do it. But you don't have to do a mother may I to launch defensive systems. So the Composite Warfare Commander promulgates intent and monitors the comms, he and his staff. Warfare area commanders have full responsibility in their areas, and they coordinate with each other. And full responsibility means they set policy and they execute it. Anybody in this system who has the name commander has the ability to set policy. We're going to do X. Anybody that has a name called coordinator helps the warfare commanders execute. Or if you're a functional commander, right? If you're the guy who's in charge of the network, or you're the helo element coordinator, if you're the helo element coordinator, you don't set the policy, but your job is to make sure that the helicopters are always available when you need helicopters. So you may be managing the helicopters, but you're not setting the policy by them. And remember how I said at the very first slide how to make an Army guy's head hurt? I didn't tell the story about how this talk came about. This talk came about when I was at a wargaming conference, 2003 ish, something like that, 2004. And it was the Connections Wargaming Conference. And Joe Miranda, who some of you know, he's an incredibly prolific wargame designer who works for Decision Games these days. He had been an old SPI guy. Joe Miranda says, he's up on stage. He's a retired Army officer. Now, he's been retired a long time. The Army is closer to being like the Navy than it was in his day. But he talked about how giving detailed orders, and this is how you do it, you give detailed orders. And I raised my hand and I said, that's not how the Navy does it. And he goes, okay, how's the Navy do it? And I said, the Navy, the admiral he promulgates his intent. He tells his warfare commanders what he wants them to do. And then he and his staff just sit back and listen. And if they like what they're hearing, he doesn't say a word. and Joe went tilt on stage because this was so far, this is not the way the Army, that his Army anyway, did it. So command by negation is all about sitting back, listening, and only getting on the radio and contradicting them and, giving an order when you need to. In my time at sea, I've heard the admiral and his staff get on the radio a half dozen times total out of 87 days of sea time. And in most cases, it is currently 14:35. You were supposed to give me a report at 14:30. Where's your report? A couple of times there was this is Bravo, Bravo, belay that order, do X instead, which is exactly what command by negation is. Don't do what that guy just told you to, do this instead. Normally that's not what happened though. It was very rare that happened. So a couple of sidebars here. One is about call signs. So all the composite warfare commanders and coordinators have a 2-letter call sign, and their backups also have these 2-letter call signs of like Foxtrot X-ray. Now, back, if I remember correctly, yeah, Carl Vinson was everything associated with Carl Vinson back when I was on board Carl Vinson started with Foxtrot. I don't know if that's current or not. Foxtrot X-ray in particular was the undersea warfare commander. Foxtrot Zulu was the sea combat commander, who was also the undersea warfare commander. By U.S. doctrine, the surface commander and the subsurface commander were the same person. So the sea combat commander was Zulu. The X-ray was the subsurface commander. Sierra was the surface commander. They're all the same person by doctrine. Now, that having been said, doctrine is a set of guidelines. It's not hard and fast. I have seen instances where they split them. You don't want to split them because you're using the same forces and you want them coordinated. Sometimes they'd split them. But then you also have things like subsets of that. So for instance, November was the screen commander. So the screen are the ships that at that given time are given a defensive role of protecting the battle, the aircraft carrier. So you might have a ship that's over here doing something different. It's still part of the force, but it's got a different individual assignment. It's not maneuvering with the carrier. So I've seen somebody get on the radio and say Foxtrot, this is Foxtrot Bravo, do X, and then actually it wouldn't be Bravo, it'd be Zulu. This is Foxtrot Zulu. Foxtrot, this is Foxtrot Zulu, do X, and then break, November, this is Foxtrot November, do Y. Same guy talking on the radio, didn't even hang it up and pick it up again. But in the first case, he's working as the sea combat commander, giving orders to everybody who's part of, that he can give orders to. And then on the second case, he's there as functioning as the screen commander, giving orders just to the screen. All these guys have backups. Frequently, like there isn't a backup for Zulu that I know of. When you get to the backup, they split up X-ray and they split up Sierra, and they're just individual ship captains. And so the idea is, like, if you lose the carrier for some reason, it goes to the backups. Like, for instance, I was on board USS Constellation for 36 hours, which, as it turns out, is more than enough time for a main space fire. It was described as by one of the chiefs as the worst fire he had ever seen that didn't kill anybody. And because we had this fire going on in our engine room, there was some thought that we might lose power. And as a result, we might lose comms. And so what ended up happening is Zulu made the decision to shift the responsibility to the backups. Good training, if nothing else. So Zulu says, all right, backups, you got it. And those guys have their own designated 2-letter, and I don't remember what they are. I just don't. There's a big long list of what everybody is. And so Zulu continued to maintain a plot. They continued to track it, but they weren't giving orders because at any time they felt that they could drop off the network. And they just sort of tracked what everybody else did, which means if you're the backup, you better really be paying attention, because at any point the ball might get handed to you and it's now your responsibility to manage that problem. Like I said, it's really good training to do that. The other thing is radio circuits have owners. So you'd set it to a particular channel. And for instance, SCC CNR, Sea Combat Commander Contact and Reporting, owned by the Sea Combat Commander. It was the primary way in which the Sea Combat Commander talked to his people. So as a general rule, it was either the Sea Combat Commander talking to his people or his people talking to the Sea Combat Commander. If you do not own a radio and you want to use the circuit for some reason, you very politely request permission. So it might be something like, Foxtrot Zulu, this is O'Kane. Request permission to use the circuit. And they'd wait. It's like, you're given permission to use the circuit. You'd use the circuit, and then at the end you'd say, relinquishing the circuit back, or the equivalent of I'm done. You only have one conversation going on at any given time on a radio circuit. Trying to have two different groups, even if one group is sort of like, somebody's working the problem and they're not talking right now, you only have one going on at a time. Think about how data links can change all this. Okay, so here's some of those. The specific 2 letters I talked about. The composite warfare commander is always Bravo. The information warfare commander, the command and control warfare commanders was Quebec. And Quebec is usually at least at the time, was the CO of the aircraft carrier. The air warfare commander he's the defensive guy. He's Foxtrot Whiskey. And so, or sometimes just called Alpha Whiskey for air warfare commander. It's just like Commander Air Group. It's not called an air group, but he's still called the Commander Air Group, despite the fact he commands an air wing. So sometimes just tradition holds. Foxtrot Zulu is the Sea Combat Commander, and he's got the Surface Warfare Commander and the Undersea Warfare Commander hats on as well. If you're going to have separate guys, and the one time I saw them split that up was a situation where you had a foreign command staff on board, and so they sort of split it up because they wanted jobs for everybody to do. And sometimes they split it up that way to give some of our NATO allies some practice in dealing with the system a little bit more. And then the Strike Warfare Commander was Papa, and the Strike Warfare Commander is the commander of the air group. So he's wearing one administrative hat where he owns all the airplanes. He's wearing another hat where he not only owns the airplanes, but he also owns the Tomahawk missiles that are on the ships. So think about this. You've got multiple people giving orders to the ships. You've got the air warfare commander giving them orders with regard to what they're going to do in terms of doing air warfare stuff. You've got the sea combat commander telling them what to do with regard to submarine threats and with regard to surface threats. And you've got the strike warfare commander talking to them about strike stuff, which sounds like a recipe for real problems. The solution is all those warfare commanders need to be talking to each other. So they spend a lot of time coordinating with each other to make sure they understand who owns what asset at any given time, right? Like the air warfare commander might say, I need a guy 20 miles in that direction over there down the threat axis because that's where I think the threat's going to be coming from. I need him over there. Okay, the sea combat commander knows that he's not going to be there doing ASW stuff. He's not available for ASW tasking. He's going to, okay, you've got him. You've got him. And they have to work out, under what circumstances do you call an audible? Like it's like, oh shit, there's a submarine real close. I need this guy to go pounce on him. That might be something where you make it work out. Now, I should say that I'm not, I was never in those conversations. I was always in the X-ray module watching the ASW people do their thing. So I never got to really see the warfare commanders talk to each other. I got a tour of the Tactical Flag Command Center a couple of times, but I never spent any time watching them do their job. So my view was sort of idiosyncratic. So I talked about functional commanders and coordinators. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So you've got like the Maritime Intercept Operations Officer. If you're doing a blockade, if you're doing law enforcement type stuff, maybe you're looking for smugglers, you've got a guy who's sort of in charge of that. And he's doing a lot of the planning for that. And he may be off alone and unafraid doing it sort of by himself. If you're going to split off a surface action group to go off and do stuff, you may designate somebody to be the surface action group commander. You've got the underway replenishment group, which is usually not escorted, but in time of war might have an escort along with it. You've got lots of coordinators. The Force Over the Horizon Track Coordinator. Now, that's a job that I know has changed. The title has changed. I don't know what the new job is, but that's the guy who sort of coordinates tracking all the stuff that's over the horizon that is not immediately within the sensor sweep of the ship. So it's like you might be using national sensors, etc. It's like we know that there's guys over there in port. They're not a problem. They're not directly near us yet, but we're paying attention to them because they might come into our area. You've got like the Helo Element Coordinator. He's the guy who might call up and say, okay, USS Umpty Frats, you need to take your helo down for maintenance now. And even if it's not time for it to come down to maintenance right now, because otherwise you may end up with all the helos going down for maintenance at the same time. He's the guy who's responsible for making sure that when one of those warfare commanders needs a helicopter to do something, there is the appropriate kind of helicopter available. So he's paying attention to what they need, and he's making sure it's like, okay, these guys have, these guys need to come down for maintenance so that I've got them later. And so he's managing those assets. The Submarine Element Coordinator and the submarine with the possible assistance of a submarine advisory team is the guy talking to the submarines to coordinate stuff with them. And they're always submarine qualified. You got the Battle Force Logistics Coordinator is about making sure that all the logistics stuff happens. Screen Coordinator, I already talked about, November. Maneuvering Coordinator, I'm not real sure what the Maneuvering Coordinator does. That's not a role that I've ever really heard anything about. So I'm not real sure. You'll notice that there's somebody missing on this, though. Where's the captain of the aircraft carrier? He's not listed on here anywhere. But he's also an 06, although the Composite Warfare Commander Warfare Domain Commanders, they're all Navy captains. They're 06s. The captain of the CV is also an 06. Where is he? Well, he's in an interesting situation in that he works for the Officer in Tactical Command, the Composite Warfare Commander. He's a peer with the Sea Combat Commander and the CAG, who are both embarked aboard his ship with their people. The Sea Combat Commander just has his staff with him. The CAG has all the airplanes and all the squadron people. The CV commanding officer owns the ship, and that means he owns the catapults. He owns the hangar. He owns the Combat Direction Center and the radios in it. He owns most of the people in the Combat Direction Center. He owns most of the enlisted people in there and some of the officers. He owns the flight deck crew. He doesn't own the airplanes. He doesn't own half the people on the ship, the air wing personnel. So he doesn't own the mechanics. He owns the people who move the planes around, but he doesn't own the people who fix the planes. And he owns the Sea Combat. He doesn't own the Sea Combat Commander's personnel, which is a staff, like maybe 30 people-ish. He provides a lot of manpower to these other people, the deck crew, the enlisted support for the Sea Combat Commander, the enlisted support for the flag staff. He owns a lot of these things. He doesn't. He also doesn't own the admirals people, right? The admiral's got his own staff on board. So he's in this weird situation where he's the landlord in that he owns the ship, but his boss is one of his tenants, and his peers are his tenants. And so it's kind of an interesting situation where it's like, I own the ship. I'm responsible for the ship, and you're on board the ship. So Like he gets to assign where the cabins are, although that's generally there's certain specific answers that they've come up with over time that are the general answers for that. Okay, another little sidebar about data links. So, back in the old days, we passed stuff by radio. So you've got radar operators that are getting on the radio and they're controlling airplanes. You've got controllers that are like they're seeing radar stuff and they're sending airplanes out to intercept airplanes that are coming into, kamikazes are coming in. They vector fighters out to do that. A lot of the stuff these days, the actual data is being passed as a direct connection between electronic systems. So you pass stuff out on the data link and I can see it on my radar display. And you can even pass text messages out there. This has been what is known as track quality data. It means I can tell where things are approximately, but it's not good enough to shoot. So you can think of this as I can tell you, hey, we're out in the woods together, and we've got binoculars. You've got a set of binoculars, and I spot something. I can tell you, third tree from the left, look there, right? And you can put up your binoculars and you can see there. But I'm just giving you track quality data. Yeah, look in the third tree from the left. Use your own sensors to look there. Whereas nowadays, we're beginning to pass, and this has been like the last 10, 15 years, we've started passing target quality data. And that means data that's good enough to shoot off of, right? It's the equivalent of being able to say, take your gun, and I'm going to tell you exactly where to point the gun so that all you need to do is just point the gun exactly where I tell you. You don't even need to look through the the scope, because I'll tell you exactly where to point it. So this all started off with cooperative engagement capability on the Aegis combat system. So Aegis shooters, all the destroyers and the cruisers could pass data back and forth. And so basically I'm passing my radar data and my position to your computers, and you calculate based upon my radar data where you can shoot. You don't have to have your radars on. So this is the sort of thing that you might think that data link, when you get the one sentence explanation about what data links do, you'd think that this is the stuff that it does. But this is actually relatively recent. It used to be until fairly recently, if an Aegis ship could pass a track over, but another Aegis ship would actually have to have its radar on and see it with its own radar in order to shoot at it. Now you've got something called NIFCA, Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, that adds that capability to E2s. So now an Aegis ship can fire off an airborne link and all sorts of other platforms. And I don't have a good reading these days on exactly everything that's in there. I don't know if we're yet at the point where like an F-35 can pass information to an Aegis shooter or vice versa. If we're not there, I'm sure that's where we're headed. So I always describe this as we're finally doing all the stuff to make data links work like the way that you would think that they worked if somebody just gave you the 10-second explanation about what a data link is, and making them work like they work in science fiction. I mean, what I described is exactly how, with NIFCA, et cetera, that's exactly how data links work in the Honor Harrington universe and the Starfire universe, right? You can pass targeting quality data between ships and you can fire off of it. That's brand spanking new, well, 15 years now, and it's a work in progress. Pretty new with the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military in general. Okay, tactical symbology. This is interesting because for a couple of reasons. First of all, the symbology was originally designed to be used on very simple displays, but there's a feature to this. Sometimes people say, why don't you use like little airplanes and stuff? This is actually way more readable than little airplanes, because you don't have to worry about, I'm 17 hours into a 12-hour shift and I'm looking at an airplane that's upside down, and now it's just not gelling with me. This stuff is very, very readable, and you've got basically different types, different shapes to represent whether it's friendly and what type of asset it is. Is it surface? Is it airborne? Is it subsurface? And those little lines coming out of it, the longer the line, the faster it's going, and the direction the line is going is the direction it's moving. So it's a vector arrow telling you exactly what it's doing. And it helps you sort of maintain situational awareness. Data links can kind of screw this up, though, because if you've got multiple platforms that are submitting stuff to a common link, you could find yourself in a situation where they are not in sync, where the same thing is in the link twice, and if the position is off a little bit because you're not perfectly calibrated, it may look like there's stuff there that's not really there. I know of instances. I know of one instance in particular where they figured out at the last second, no, the airplanes we are about to shoot are actually U.S. airplanes, and it was caused by there being duplicate stuff in the link. And so they didn't take the shot because they thought what they were shooting at was enemy planes that were following U.S. planes. In reality, it was a two-ship of U.S. planes that was located on the display twice. And they had to do some track management. Now, that wasn't with Aegis. That was with Link 11 back in the old days. But it can get really complicated. This stuff is hard. We've been working at it for 40 years, and it's still hard. Okay, so let's talk about science fiction a little bit. We're on the home stretch now. So let's take a look at that bottom line up front again, another look at the problem summary, and then I'm going to talk about communication, span of control, and examples from science fiction. So bottom line up front. Remember I said U.S. Navy has this particular command and control doctrine that I think is actually readily convertible to science fiction, but take that with a grain of salt. So keep in mind for the next slide, it's gross generalizations. It's all assumptions dependent. Most science fiction works don't tell us the behind the scenes stuff, and this is kind of behind the scenes stuff. We don't know exactly what their model of space combat is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of caveats attached to this. Some of these are clearer cases than others. But take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm trying to be an honest broker here. Excuse me. So here's the summary of the problem. So do we have something that looks like rapid growth and potential threat? Yeah, that's kind of a reasonable concern in some of the science fiction universes that we see. Is it highly capable and multi-domain? Well, it's only one domain because you only have space as a general rule. You might have fire coming up from the planet, but it has to come to space to get there. So it's not really multi-domain. And one of the things I didn't really talk about that I probably should have is that one of the ideas behind why multi-domain is important is because the difference in speed of the different domains. So, anti-submarine warfare is often referred to as awfully slow warfare. It can take hours to develop, sometimes days, whereas air stuff happens really fast. And so when you try to mix and match this stuff, it's hard to sort of constantly shift modes from something that's moving fast to something that's moving slow and vice versa. That's one of the reasons why you break it up. You have different people work different parts of the problem. So in this particular case, everything is in one domain. But, you could potentially view it as some stuff is happening really far away and I'm seeing it far away and I don't really have to worry about it, whereas other stuff is up close and personal. So maybe you can kind of get the effect of having multiple domains. It's unclear exactly what the reaction time with this looks like. It's really sort of assumptions dependent. Do we have increased reliance on comms with increased vulnerability of comms? I'd say in science fiction, the answer is generally yes, or it's at least a reasonable thing to think. And do we think that we might have effective span of control problems? Well, yeah, take a look at some of the slides I'm going to show you, and it becomes apparent that, maybe you've bitten off more than you can chew. So what are the implications for communications? Well, with any set of assumptions that are not purely fantastical, communications are likely to be a problem because, first of all, you would still have jamming. And second of all, You might have a light speed lag, right? If you're 30 light seconds away from other members of your force and your communications are speed of light communications, he can't hear you for 30 seconds. So meaningful communication is impacted. Meaningful bandwidth is degraded in terms of your ability to like give him detailed instructions, etc. I'm going to argue that in some cases, the light speed lag, if your forces are far enough apart, you can think of light speed lag as being very, very similar to jamming, which is one of the reasons why I think this is relevant. So historically, if you can say that, a lot of space battles we see in science fiction are very huge. This is from EVE Online. I mean, this is a small battle from EVE Online. So you've got these huge battles. How do you do command and control for a huge battle? You're certainly not giving detailed instructions to each one of those ships. The admiral is not giving detailed instructions. You have to break it into pieces. You have to have local commanders who can control their various things. You have to sort of do something that looks like composite warfare commander, or you can never make that work. So let's take a look at some examples from science fiction. We'll look at the new Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5, Star Wars. I usually try to avoid Star Wars in talks like this, but I'll talk about Star Wars a little bit. Star Trek, Honor Harrington, and Jack Campbell's Lost Fleet series. Remember, nothing I say should prevent you from enjoying any work of science fiction. So Battlestar Galactica, relatively small number of ships. Light speed lag in theory could be important. I would expect the Cylons to be jamming them more than they are. But in this particular case, I would expect that if you were dealing with more warships, you'd have something that looked more like potentially like a composite warfare commander system. But as it is, at most you had just a couple of warships plus a bunch of fighters. And so maybe it's not real applicable there, but I think it could have been if for no other reason than this is aircraft carriers in space, and CWC doctrine was really sort of designed to deal with air-type threats. So Babylon 5, I frequently criticize Babylon 5 for not having enough pre-planned responses. There are things that I think that they should be doing that they're not. There's the example that I've used before of the set piece battle where the Alliance is on the offensive. In fact, this may even be from the episode where they were planning that battle, because a large chunk of it took place in that war room, where they've got actually, I'm going to stop for a little comment that Rob said. Adama's got a real problem with the number of JOs he trusts. Yeah. And that's in part, that's because if you were assigned to the Galactica, you were either a screw up or you were really unlucky. That was a hard luck ship. That was a ship that wasn't the pride of the fleet anymore. And it was not the ship that you wanted to be on. And so, Kara Thrace didn't wig out. She just went back to being herself. So in Babylon 5, you've got the issue where they go through the jump and they come out, and Sheridan starts saying little ships cover big ships, blah, 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 telling people what their job should be, when in reality that should be at most execute Alpha 4. Everybody should have understood what their jobs were. He should have given them mission type orders to begin with, and then maybe called an audible that would have been just this is the one we're going to do it. So there really wasn't much in there along those lines. So Star Wars, okay, that's a span of control problem. I don't even know where to start on this, because Star Wars is an example of they don't really seem to pay any attention to command and control whatsoever. It's one of the reasons why I don't like using it as an example. But that mess that you see there, I think, is a really good example of span of control issues. How do you do command and control for something like that? Now we're going to get to the ones that I think actually are better examples. So in Star Trek, you very rarely in most of the movies and in everything except Deep Space Nine, you never really have a situation where you have to do command and control for large numbers of vessels. It's usually one-on-ones or one-on-twos or some other very small number. In Deep Space Nine, there are some implications about what the command and control looks like there. And I need to go and watch Deep Space Nine again before I get deep in the weeds on talking about what command and control in Deep Space Nine looks like. There seems to be a case of they've got a lot of common doctrine, so they kind of know what to do. But we don't have a whole lot of insight onto what's going on in the bridge of ships that aren't named Defiant in that show. So we don't really see what's going on with everybody else. So I wish we knew more about what was going on in Star Trek. We know quite a lot about what's going on in Honor Harrington because it's a series of books, and David Weber tells us. In that universe, they very specifically do give mission type orders, go and do X. But it's much more of a squadron sort of orientation. It looks a lot more like what we saw in World War I than it does what we saw in World War II going forward, where you sort of, you've got the wall of battle, which is the equivalent of the battle line. You don't have things broken up, and you don't really have things that look, we don't see something that really looks like composite warfare commander doctrine. But we do see that it looks like sort of standard World War I type command and control. At some point, I should have a conversation with David more about how they actually go about doing this. The place where I think, though, that CWC doctrine would make a lot of sense is actually the Lost Fleet series by Jack Campbell. Now, Jack Campbell is actually a pen name of John Hemry. John is a 1977 graduate of the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. He was a surface warfare officer, but he's a decent guy anyway. And he's the one where I really started thinking, reading his books, or I really started thinking in terms of light speed lag as being the equivalent of Russian jamming. Because Blackjack Geary has a real problem communicating with far-flung elements of his fleet. He's seeing stuff a lot time late, so he doesn't have the option of giving them detailed orders. Even if he wanted to, they're too far away. He's got to basically give them mission type orders and let them do their thing. And so because of that, it really seems analogous to jamming. And so it really got me thinking about composite warfare commander doctrine. And it's specifically the command by negation aspect of it. Breaking it up into different warfare areas may or may not make sense, especially given the way that battles in that universe work. The range of the weapons is short enough and the speeds are high enough that it's usually high speed passes that are pre-programmed in. And so basically what happens is you do a high-speed pass, the total amount of firing is all computer controlled. It happens over the space of about 2 to 3 seconds. And then you count noses afterwards to see who was destroyed on your side, and you watch the tapes in slow-mo to see who was destroyed on the other side. And that's kind of how battles work in that universe. So it's not a perfect analogy to modern naval combat, but at least that light speed lag aspect and this idea that I'm going to have to give mission type orders and send them off and do their thing seems to kind of work. So that's pretty much it for the presentation. I'm going to do a real quick look through here and see if there's any questions I want to answer tonight. So going back to the very beginning, Delon asks, is there anybody out there? Yes. He asks whether I'm one of the people out there. Yes. He asks whether I have an employer. Yes. Let's see. Going down here. Yes, I did mention I don't talk for my employer. Okay. So Donnie says he was reworking his recreation of Jerry Smith's theme from Star Trek The Motion Picture into that of the extended version with the TOS theme. That sounds like an interesting project. Okay. Okay, so somebody was asking about the film, and I'll go ahead and give my standard answer for the film, despite the fact that I don't speak for my employer. I also don't speak for Alec Peters, but I will point out a couple of things about how this works out. So first of all, everything came to a halt when Alec got sued. When the production got sued, everything comes to a halt because you really can't work on the project while you can't be spending money, et cetera, while the lawsuit is going on, because you may end up just being told you have to give it all back or something like that. So everything sort of stops while Alec works on dealing with the lawsuit. The lawsuit gets resolved. A couple of years have gone by. At that point, you now have to go back and sort of figure out who's still on board and who isn't, because even if this wasn't a volunteer project, you still have situations where people have moved on. Right, they're doing other stuff, etc. It's all volunteer, so you get people of varying quality. I know that there's been some personnel issues with people that got pulled on board, but the important thing is that if nothing else, you have to go back and count noses and say, "Hey, are you still in?" "Yeah, I'd like to be, but I can't be anymore. I've kind of moved on. I'm working on this other project. I can't do it." So it takes a while to get. It's not just like you just parked the car and you ran into the house to get something, you came back out and you get in the car and put in gear and drive away. You got to restart everything. They did the restart. They shot a bunch of footage, some of which had to be reshot later, and then COVID hits. So I'm actually surprised they're as far along as they are, because in a lot of cases, with all the different stuff that got thrown on them, it wouldn't have surprised me if it never comes out. Whereas they're at the point now where they've got a handful of scenes they need to reshoot. In fact, they may actually have already done all that stuff, and they're just in the process of finishing the special effects and putting it all together, etc. So that's where it is. I do not speak for Alec. That's me on the outside sort of looking at it. He and I really haven't talked about it. This is just me sort of what I've gleaned from all the different things that I've seen. Yeah, let's see. I'm going down here. Yeah, with regard to Commander Adama, Rob says he's also got a 1 or 2 ship group, which means he's probably missing half their layers of command. Adama just doesn't have enough people to fill the need, and that's entirely true. I mean, people were transferring off the ship because that ship was within hours of being decommissioned. The Pegasus had gotten slammed pretty badly in a battle, so they lost a lot of people. Now they're pulling people in from the fleets, from the refugees. So they've got people that are in uniform that really don't have a whole lot of experience. I remember at one point when the Cylons board the ship, they made some comment about, yeah, we got 7 Marines. Okay, 7, right? And so it's real tough to sort of make that happen. They were scraping the barrel. They were scraping the barrel. So Rob Davidoff says, I figured the early war Lost Fleet had a lot more command capability, but the expertise for it is largely gone. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. In fact, he talks in the stories about how their tactics had ossified. They took such casualties early on that their tactics got very, very simple, and they got basically turned into, it was all about dramatic charges. Everything was a cavalry charge for those guys, basically. That's really all they knew how to do, and they didn't have the time to sort of develop the deep knowledge that they needed to make things work. It's sort of like what you have in World War II with Japan. At the beginning of the war, Japan had all these pilots that had, like 5,000 hours in the cockpit. By the end of the war, they've got pilots that have 300 hours in the cockpit. There's a big difference between them. Big difference. Yeah, and Rob says we kind of see his lead character. This is John Henry's lead character. Do that, Blackjack Geary. Do that more as he trains JOs he trusts to be off the leash and not just run straight in shooting. So yeah, it takes a while. He's got to basically change the command culture. It takes a while to do that. Okay. TJ says he's going to send me something later, and I am looking forward to seeing it because TJ's done some great work on the show, and hopefully it's something that he can share with us. Rob again. I think both Lost Fleet and BSG point at missing layers in command as a story point. A command structure as it should work, implied mostly by why it's not working that way for our protagonist. Yeah, and the other thing is I've asked John about this because I've basically said, look, Blackjack needs a staff, right? He needs a chief of staff. He needs at least a couple of people working for him. He needs a staff. And John's response was basically, duh, I know that. No, he didn't really put it that way. He said, yeah, you're right. He does. Last thing in the world I need to do is add more characters. And so this is an instance of, in the real world, there would have been more people involved and Blackjack Geary would have had more help. In this book, he didn't because the author was already juggling a lot of characters. And it's hard to just sort of say he had the staff do it or something like that, because naturally you would expect the staff to be right there. It's hard to envision a situation like the one he was in where the staff wouldn't have been core characters. So instead, what he ends up doing is that he ends up relying very, very heavily on his flag captain. The captain of the battle cruiser he's on is basically the person who functions as his staff to the degree that he has one whatsoever. Yeah, and Rob said something about that. Keeping the character count down helps. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I've got for this evening, everybody. So next week I'm going to try to do maybe Prefect. Maybe I'm going to do a summary of all the naval stuff I did previously because I want to do that. Maybe I'm going to do I might do battle line versus battle group tactics and the sort of the implications for science fiction and why you might want to do one versus the other. I think I need to think that through a little bit more. I'm pretty sure that the answer I'm coming down to on that is it's all about command and control. Need to really sort of think that through a lot better than I'm able to right now, than I've done right now. So let's see. I'm trying to think of anything else. So, Lissa, why don't you come on for just a second? So,
hello.
So you're not going to be here next week. So,
no, I will not.
And I won't be here the week after. So it'll be a couple of weeks before we get together again.
It's very true.
And hopefully by then Kat will be back and we can get the band back together.
Yeah, we can get the band back together eventually. One day. One day.
Eventually. But I thought I'd just bring you back on board so that we could say goodbye together.
Yep. Alrighty, guys. Thank you all for listening and being here. Chris will see you next week. I will see you in 2 weeks, I guess, since Chris won't be here the week I get back. So we'll make it all happen. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good night. Live long and prosper, guys. Toodles.